The periscope broke the surface for only 3 seconds, long enough for Commander Toshio Kusaka to sweep the horizon, long enough for his world to fracture. Through the salt spray glass, he counted them. 7, 9, 12. He kept counting. The destroyers stretched across the Philippine Sea like a steel fence, their hulls dark against the morning haze of November 8, 1944. Kusaka's hands trembled as he lowered the scope. In the cramped control room of submarine I-36, the ventilation fans hummed their mechanical prayer, while 29 men waited for their commander to speak. He had been taught to expect 50 American destroyers in the entire Pacific theater. He had just counted 17 in a single convoy screen. "All stop," he whispered. Silent running. The fans died. The submarine settled into the dark water off Leyte Gulf like a wounded animal seeking cover. In the sudden quiet, Kusaka could hear his executive officers breathing, rapid, shallow. The younger man had seen it too, the impossible fleet that shouldn't exist, hunting them with sound waves and depth charges across an ocean the Imperial Navy had once called its own. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was not what they had promised him at Itajima, the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, where Kusaka had graduated 8th in his class of 1932. Not what the intelligence briefings had assured him during his final shore leave in Kura before this patrol. The Americans, he had been told with absolute certainty, possessed neither the industrial capacity nor the cultural discipline to build warships at the pace required to dominate the Pacific. Their economy was designed for luxury automobiles and motion pictures, not the austere demands of naval warfare. Their workers were soft, distracted by jazz music and trade unions. Japan, forged in the crucible of national sacrifice, would outlast them through superior spirit and efficient production. Commander Kusaka had believed this. Every officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed this. They had to believe it, because the alternative that a single nation could outproduce the combined shipyards of Japan, Germany, and Italy was too terrible to accept. It would mean the war was already lost, had perhaps been lost the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. But belief does not stop sonar, and spirit cannot sink steel. The I-36 was a Type B submarine, 2,884 tons displacement, capable of cruising 14,000 nautical miles without refueling. She carried 17 torpedoes and a crew trained in the samurai tradition of absolute obedience. Kusaka had taken her through the American destroyer screen off Guadalcanal in 1943, had put 2 torpedoes into a Liberty ship off New Guinea, had survived 9 depth charge attacks that had cracked pipes and shattered gauges but never broken his faith in ultimate victory. He was a professional, a graduate of the submarine school at Kure, a man who understood machinery and mathematics and the cold equations of naval warfare. And the equations no longer made sense. Before the war, in the final intelligence estimates compiled in the summer of 1941, Japanese naval intelligence had calculated American destroyer strength with what they believed was Germanic precision. The United States Navy possessed approximately 170 destroyers in commission. The Americans might build another 30 to 40 destroyers per year, a respectable rate, certainly, but nothing extraordinary. Most of these would be needed for Atlantic convoy escort duties against German U-boats. The Pacific Theater, intelligence, assured the Naval General Staff, would see perhaps 50 to 70 American destroyers at most. Japan's own destroyer force numbered over 100 vessels, modern and well-trained. The mathematics favored Tokyo. Kusaka had carried these numbers into battle like a talisman. They were part of his training, embedded in his tactical thinking, fundamental to every decision he made when the periscope broke the surface, and he had to decide in 3 seconds whether to attack or dive. 50 American destroyers spread across the vast Pacific meant gaps in their screen, opportunities for a skilled submarine commander to slip through, to reach the vulnerable cargo ships and tankers that fed MacArthur's advancing armies. 50 destroyers meant hope. 17 destroyers in a single convoy screen meant something else entirely. It meant the intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically, impossibly wrong. In the control room, Kusaka pulled out his patrol chart already stained with salt water and marked with careful pencil notations. Each X represented a destroyer contact. In the past 11 days, since departing Brunei on October 28th, I-36 had logged 32 separate destroyer contacts, not encounters, contacts. Times when he had seen destroyers and been forced to abort attacks, to dive deep and rig for silent running, to crawl away at 2 knots, while their propellers churned overhead and their sonar pinged against his hull like hammers on a bell. 32 contacts in 11 days. And this was just one submarine in one operating area, covering perhaps 200 nautical miles of ocean. If the Americans had deployed destroyers at this density across the entire Philippine Sea, across the approaches to Formosa, across the convoy routes to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Kusaka forced himself to do the arithmetic. His hand moved across the chart, calculating, estimating, trying to reconcile the evidence of his eyes with the certainty of his training. The numbers that emerged were obscene, impossible. The Americans would need 300 destroyers. 400, perhaps more. He checked his mathematics again. The same answer emerged, patient and pitiless as the sonar sweeping the water above his submarine. The executive officer leaned close, speaking barely above a whisper, even though they were deep enough that no surface microphone could detect them. "Commander, the fuel situation. We must break contact and proceed to the rendezvous point." Kusaka nodded. I-36 had enough diesel fuel for 3 more days of patrol, then the long run back to Brunei. 3 more days of finding not enemy cargo ships but enemy destroyers, everywhere, always, an endless procession of them like ants at a picnic. 3 more days of discovering that everything he had been taught was a lie. But when did the lie begin? Not at Itajima, those instructors had been honest men, teaching what they believed. Not in the intelligence briefings, those analysts had worked with the data available to them, data provided by naval attachés in Washington before the war, by agents and observers who had counted the destroyers at anchor in San Diego and Norfolk and Pearl Harbor. The numbers had been real. The Americans had possessed 170 destroyers. This was fact, not propaganda. What naval intelligence had failed to understand, what no one in the Imperial Navy had been able to conceive, was the nature of American industry itself. They had counted existing ships and extrapolated at reasonable rates the way a rational military power would expand its navy. They had assumed the Americans would build destroyers the way Japan built destroyers, carefully, methodically, in established naval yards using experienced workers and traditional construction methods. A destroyer took 14 to 18 months to build, required specialized workers and precision machinery and constant quality control. You could not simply wish destroyers into existence. There were physical limits to production, limits that applied equally to Japanese and American shipyards, except the Americans had ignored those limits. In the darkness beneath the Philippine Sea, Kusaka stared at his chart and tried to understand. Somewhere in America, in places he had never heard of, cities that did not appear on his naval charts, something unprecedented was happening. The Americans were building destroyers the way they had built those Liberty ships, the ugly welded cargo vessels that had appeared in swarms across the Pacific like metal locusts. They were building them not as warships but as products, mass-produced items rolling off assembly lines with the same casual abundance as automobiles or refrigerators. This was the thought that haunted him. The Americans were not straining to build their fleet. They were not sacrificing, not scraping together resources, not choosing between destroyers and civilian goods. They were building destroyers and liberty ships and escort carriers and sending their young men to war in uniforms that were never patched, never, worn thin, never reused from dead soldiers. They were fighting this war with their surplus capacity, with the excess production that remained after feeding their civilians better than most Japanese soldiers ate. Kusaka had seen one of those liberty ships die off Guadalcanal, torpedoed at night, her hull glowing orange from internal fires. He had watched through the periscope as her crew abandoned ship in orderly fashion, lifeboats lowered with mechanical efficiency, No panic, no chaos. And he had noted with professional detachment that even as she settled by the stern, even as the sea poured into her holds, another Liberty ship, identical to her, was steaming past just 3,000 yards away. And another beyond that. The Americans had not paused to rescue survivors. A destroyer had peeled off from the screen to do that work, as if they had destroyers to spare for such tasks. The convoy had simply closed ranks and continued. That single lost ship as inconsequential as a single round of ammunition expended in a firefight. How many Liberty ships had he seen? Kusaka had stopped counting at 40. How many destroyers? The chart before him showed 32 contacts, but he knew there were more, many more. Destroyers he had heard on the hydrophone but never seen. Destroyers operating in areas where I-36 could not safely patrol. Destroyers escorting convoys he would never intercept because the screen was too dense, too professional, too alert. The Americans had turned naval warfare into a mathematics problem, and they were solving it with arithmetic that Japan could not match. The Imperial Navy measured its strength in quality in the oxygen torpedoes that ran faster and farther than anything America possessed, in the crews trained to perfection through brutal discipline, in the Yamato-class battleships whose 18-inch guns were the most powerful afloat. These were weapons that took years to perfect, that required craftsmen and expertise, and the accumulated wisdom of a warrior culture. The Americans measured strength in quantity, not better destroyers, adequate destroyers, not superior crews, adequate crews, not technological marvels, functional tools produced at a rate that made quality almost irrelevant. If you could build 5 adequate destroyers in the time it took to build 1 superior destroyer, you did not need superiority. You needed factories. Hydrophone contact, the sonar operator whispered. Multiple propellers, bearing 045, range 4,000 meters. Classification, destroyer, possibly 2. Kusaka closed his eyes. Of course there were more. There were always more. Maintain silent running. Come to heading 180, 5 degrees down bubble. Take us to 90 meters. I-36 tilted forward, sinking deeper into the dark water where pressure crushed the hull plates and made them groan with sounds that might give away their position. At 90 meters, they were below the optimal depth, charge setting. At 90 meters, they were also nearly at the submarine's maximum safe operating depth, where the hull plates were stressed and the rivets wept seawater in tiny streams that the crew mopped continuously. The propellers passed overhead, a rumbling thunder that filled the submarine with noise. Kusaka counted the beats. 1 destroyer, 2, 3. A hunter-killer group, working in coordination, sweeping an area where they suspected submarines might lurk. This was new doctrine, something the Americans had developed in the Atlantic against German U-boats and imported to the Pacific with their endless supply of ships. They did not wait for submarines to attack convoys. They hunted submarines proactively, devoting destroyers to the sole mission of clearing sea lanes. Japan could not do this. Japan needed every destroyer for convoy escort, for fleet actions, for the desperate defense of shrinking perimeters. Japan did not have destroyers to spare for hunting patrols. But America did. America had destroyers, the way it had jeeps and trucks and cigarettes abundant, disposable, everywhere. The propellers faded to the north. Kusaka waited another 10 minutes, then 15, before ordering the submarine back to periscope depth. When the scope broke the surface, he performed his 3-second sweep and saw them, 2 destroyers in line-ahead formation, their wakes white against the blue water, heading north at 20 knots toward some rendezvous that he could only guess at. They had not detected I-36. They were simply patrolling, methodically covering grid squares on some vast chart, ensuring that no Japanese submarine could operate freely in waters that had once belonged to the Emperor's navy. Kusaka recorded the contact in his log with mechanical precision. Time, bearing, estimated course and speed, visual classification. The log was already full of such entries, page after page of them, a catalogue of American naval power that would be read by intelligence officers in Kure or Tokyo if I-36 survived to return home, if the fuel held out, if they could slip past the destroyers that infested every approach to Brunei like antibodies in a bloodstream. He thought of his wife, Fumiko, in their small house in Yokosuka. She would be tending the garden she had coaxed from the rocky soil behind the house, growing vegetables to supplement the rationed food that grew scarcer each month. She would be wearing the same kimono she had worn when he left, because there was no fabric for new clothing, because every resource was devoted to the war effort. She would be waiting for his letters, which came irregularly now, carried by submarines and seaplanes on circuitous routes through shrinking territory. She did not know he had never written it, would never write it, that the war was lost, that her husband was hunting ghosts with weapons that no longer mattered against an enemy that could absorb every loss and return with more ships, more planes, more of everything that modern war required. At Etajima, they had taught him that spirit could overcome material deficiency, that the samurai tradition, the willingness to die for the emperor, was worth 10 times the crude materialism of the West. Kusaka had believed this with the fervor of youth, had written essays on the spiritual superiority of Japan, had practiced sword cuts until his hands bled, because the sword represented the soul of the warrior, and the warrior's soul was Japan's ultimate weapon. But spirit did not stop torpedoes. And the Americans had torpedoes that worked, not the magnificent oxygen torpedoes that Japan had perfected, but simple, crude, reliable torpedoes that exploded when they hit their targets. Japan's technological triumph had been the Type 93 torpedo, the Long Lance, which ran on pure oxygen and left no wake and could strike at 49 knots from 20 kilometers away. It was a masterpiece of engineering, requiring years of development and precision manufacturing. The Americans had never built anything like it. They did not need to. They built adequate torpedoes and installed them on 300 destroyers, and adequate multiplied by 300 was superiority. The second day of November had brought another revelation. I-36 had been patrolling off the San Bernardino Strait when Kusaka spotted what he initially classified as a destroyer. The profile was wrong, too small, but the superstructure suggested a warship rather than a cargo vessel. Through the periscope, he studied the vessel carefully, noting details for his report. She displaced perhaps 1,200 tons, mounted 3-inch guns instead of the 5-inch batteries of a proper destroyer, and her lines suggested speed rather than endurance. Not a destroyer then, but something else, something new. His recognition manual, printed in 1942, contained no entry for this ship type. Kusaka sketched the profile in his log, noting the hull number, DE-43, DE, not DD for destroyer, a different classification entirely. When he surfaced that night to charge batteries and transmit his contact report, the radio man received an urgent response from Submarine Command. DE, they informed him, designated Destroyer Escort. A new class of American warship, smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers, designed specifically for convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare. Intelligence believed the Americans were building them in large numbers. How large? Submarine Command did not say, perhaps because they did not know, perhaps because the numbers were too terrible to transmit over radio frequencies that might be intercepted and decoded. Kusaka encountered 7 more destroyer escorts in the following week. 7 different vessels, 7 different hull numbers, all in the DE classification. DE-43, DE-67, DE-112, DE-134, DE-151, DE-168, DE-202. The progression of hull numbers suggested a production run, multiple vessels under construction simultaneously, rolling out of shipyards at a pace that made no sense given what he knew about ship construction. You could not build escorts the way you built automobiles. Warships required specialized labor, precision work, quality control that could not be rushed. Except the Americans were rushing. They had somehow industrialized warship construction, had reduced the sacred art of naval architecture to an assembly line process that produced functional if unspectacular vessels at rates that defied traditional understanding. And these escorts worked. They were not technological marvels. Kusaka had noted their crude fire control systems, their basic sonar, and their simple gun arrangements. But they worked. They kept submarines down, forced them to expend battery power in evasion, prevented attacks on the cargo ships and tankers that sustained MacArthur's advance across the Pacific. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On November 12th, 4 days after the 17-destroyer convoy, I-36 detected a major fleet movement north of Leyte. Kusaka maneuvered into position carefully, using every technique he had learned in 2 years of combat patrols, every trick that had kept him alive when so many other submarine commanders had been lost. He brought the submarine to periscope depth at dusk, when the fading light made the scope harder to detect, when the angle of the sun would silhouette the American ships against the horizon. What he saw required every ounce of his professional discipline to record without emotional reaction. The American task force stretched from horizon to horizon, a vast armada moving south toward Leyte Gulf in 3 parallel columns. Kusaka counted the capital ships first, as training dictated: battleships, carriers, heavy cruisers, 6 carriers, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers. This was fleet strength that rivaled what Japan had deployed at Midway, gathered here for what appeared to be a support operation, perhaps bombardment of Japanese positions on Leyte itself. But it was the screening force that made him forget to breathe. Destroyers ringed the capital ships in concentric circles, layer upon layer of protection, a defensive formation so dense that Kusaka could not count individual vessels. He tried. He swept the periscope across the formation, attempting to catalogue what he saw with the precision expected of a submarine commander. He counted 20 destroyers on the outer screen. Then he counted the inner screen, another 18. Then he noticed the picket line extending ahead of the formation. And the trailing guard, 7 additional destroyers sweeping the task force's wake for submarines exactly, like I-36, 57 destroyers, in a single task force, moving south toward an island where other American forces were already ashore, already being supplied by convoys with their own destroyer screens, already supported by air groups flying from carriers with yet more destroyers protecting them. Kusaka lowered the periscope and stood motionless in the control room. His executive officer waited, watching his commander's face, seeing something there that made him hesitate to speak. The other officers and men maintained their stations in silence, sensing that something beyond the normal tension of combat patrol had entered their small steel world. "Log the contact," Kusaka finally said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, as if someone else were speaking. Major fleet movement. Classification: 6 carriers, 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 57 destroyers. Bearing 140, speed 14 knots, course 185. He heard the executive officer inhale sharply. 57 destroyers. More than they had been told existed in the entire Pacific theatre. More than seemed possible given what every officer in the Imperial Navy understood about American industrial capacity and shipbuilding rates. "Sir," the executive officer ventured carefully, "perhaps we miscounted? In poor light, other vessel types might appear." "I did not miscount." Kusaka's voice was harder than he intended. He softened it. "I verified the count 3 times. 57 destroyers, all in standard screening formation, all identifiable by silhouette and wake pattern, not destroyer escorts. Fleet destroyers." The executive officer nodded and retreated to his station. What else could he say? What else could any of them say? They were trapped in a steel cylinder 90 meters beneath the surface, breathing recycled air that smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, and the slow corrosion of battery acid, and the world they had known was dissolving around them, like a depth charge's wake. Kusaka did not attack. With 57 destroyers screening the formation, an attack would be suicide without even the compensation of success. He would fire his torpedoes, perhaps sink 1 destroyer or damage a carrier, and then I-36 would die under the depth charges of the other 56 destroyers, who would spend hours they could afford because they had so many ships methodically hunting the submarine until they cracked her hull and sent her crew to the bottom. The calculus of sacrifice had changed. In 1942, when destroyers were precious on both sides, sinking a carrier or battleship was worth the loss of a submarine. Now, with the Americans deploying destroyers in such numbers, the equation is no longer balanced. Japan was running out of submarines faster than it could build them, while America was producing destroyers faster than Japan could sink them. At some point, perhaps already past, the exchange rate had become unsustainable. I-36 withdrew to the south, moving slowly on electric motors, conserving battery power for the evasions that would inevitably come. Kusaka stood at the periscope station long after the American task force had disappeared over the horizon, staring at nothing, calculating numbers that refused to add up to anything except defeat. In his cabin that night, a space barely large enough to contain a bunk and a small desk, Kusaka retrieved the operational order that had sent I-36 on this patrol. The document was marked secret and bore the seal of Submarine Fleet Command. Its language was professional, bureaucratic, free of emotion. Enemy destroyer strength in the Philippine operating area is estimated at 12 to 15 vessels. Convoy operations suggest Americans have diverted additional units from the Central Pacific, possibly reducing the Formosa approach's screening force. Exploit gaps in enemy coverage to interdict supply lines to Leyte, priority targets, troop transports, tankers, ammunition ships. 12 to 15 destroyers. He had seen more than that in a single convoy screen on his first day in the operating area. The order had been written in good faith by officers who believed the intelligence they received, who trusted the pre-war estimates and the careful analysis of naval attachés who had counted American ships at anchor and extrapolated reasonable growth curves. But those estimates had been wrong from the beginning, not because the attachés were incompetent, but because they had assumed the Americans would build ships the way rational nations built ships carefully, with attention to quality, at rates constrained by available shipyard capacity and skilled labor. No one in the Imperial Navy had conceived that America would approach warship construction the way Henry Ford had approached automobile production. No one had imagined that the Americans would design destroyers not for optimal performance but for ease of construction, that they would sacrifice technological sophistication for manufacturing speed, that they would standardize components and prefabricate hull sections and weld instead of rivet because welding was faster, even if it was less elegant. The Americans had built an entirely new shipyard at Quincy, Massachusetts, dedicated solely to destroyer construction. They had expanded facilities at Bath, Maine, at Charleston, South Carolina, at San Francisco, at Seattle. They had trained workers by the tens of thousands, men and women who had never seen a warship before Pearl Harbor, teaching them to weld hull plates and install turbines and wire electrical systems. They had transformed warship construction from a craft practiced by skilled specialists into an industrial process that could be taught to a welder in 6 weeks. And they had done it while simultaneously building Liberty ships, 2,700 of them, by the end of 1944. And escort carriers, dozens of them, converted from merchant hulls on assembly lines that produced them faster than Japan could sink them, and landing craft, thousands upon thousands of them, ugly and ungainly and effective, and submarines, America's own submarine force, was ravaging Japanese merchant shipping at a rate that made Kusaka's patrols seem like futile gestures, and aircraft bombers and fighters that rolled off production lines in numbers that blotted out the sky over every island Japan tried to defend. This was the revelation that the periscope view had forced upon him. Japan was not fighting a nation. Japan was fighting a machine, a vast industrial apparatus that had only just begun to accelerate, that was now hitting its stride, producing weapons with the same casual abundance that it had once produced consumer goods. The machine had more workers than Japan had soldiers, more steel than Japan could mine, more oil than Japan could import, more of everything. And the gap was widening every day, every hour, every minute that this war continued. On November 15th, 1 week after the 17-destroyer convoy, I-36 was finally detected. It happened at dawn, during the daily battery charge. Kusaka had surfaced the submarine 4 hours before sunrise, running on diesel engines to recharge the batteries that provided power for underwater operation. This was the most vulnerable period of any patrol surfaced, visible, unable to dive quickly if detected. But submarines could not remain submerged indefinitely. The batteries that powered their electric motors needed recharging, and that required diesel engines, and diesel engines required air. Standard procedure called for the submarine to submerge before sunrise, when visibility increased and aircraft patrols intensified. Kusaka had followed this procedure religiously for 2 years. But on November 15th, the battery charge was incomplete. The chief engineer reported that they needed another 20 minutes to reach sufficient charge for a full day of submerged operation. Without that charge, I-36 would be dangerously limited in her ability to evade if detected. 20 minutes. Kusaka authorized the extension, gambling that the dawn patrols had not yet reached this sector. He lost the gamble. The lookout spotted the aircraft at 4,000 meters, already in a diving approach, a single-engine plane with fixed landing gear, a destroyer's scout float plane, probably launched from one of the destroyers they had evaded yesterday. There was no time for a controlled dive. Kusaka hit the diving alarm and shouted orders, and I-36 went under in a crash dive that was barely controlled chaos. Water pouring through the open hatch as men slid down the ladder, diesel engines roaring to a stop as electric motors took over, compressed air screaming into the ballast tanks to force water out and make the submarine heavier, taking her down fast while the propellers bit into the water and drove her forward and down into the dark safety of depth. They reached 60 meters when the first depth charge exploded. The submarine rang like a bell struck by a hammer. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation fell from the overhead in chunks. A pipe cracked somewhere aft, spraying water in a high-pressure jet until a damage control party got a clamp on it. Men clutched at handrails and stations, keeping their feet through training and practice, their faces blank with the carefully maintained calm of professionals who knew that panic was more dangerous than the explosions. More depth charges. Kusaka counted them. 6, 7, 8. Close enough to shake the submarine, but not close enough to crack the pressure hull. The Americans had not fixed their position precisely. They were dropping a pattern based on where the submarine had been when it dived, hoping to catch it in the blast radius. Standard anti-submarine doctrine, properly executed. Silent running, Kusaka ordered quietly. All stop, rig for depth charge attack. The electric motors fell silent. The submarine drifted downward on momentum alone, settling at 90 meters where the darkness was complete and the pressure made the hull groan. Every unnecessary system was shut down: ventilation, lighting in non-essential compartments, anything that made noise or drew power. The crew froze at their stations, breathing slowly, making themselves invisible to the sonar that was certainly searching for them. The destroyer arrived 8 minutes later. They heard its propellers first, a churning rumble that grew louder as the ship closed on their position. Then came the sonar, rhythmic pings that struck the submarine's hull and echoed back to the destroyer, painting a picture of their location in the mind of some American sonar operator who sat in a warm, dry compartment above, tracking them with electronic precision. More depth charges. These were closer. The explosions lifted I-36, bodily, slamming her crew against bulkheads and equipment. More pipes cracked. The stern planes jammed, requiring manual override. A seam in the pressure hull began weeping water, a steady stream that pooled on the deck plates and had to be pumped back into the bilges before the weight affected the submarine's trim. Kusaka checked his watch. They had been under depth charge attack for 17 minutes. The destroyer showed no signs of breaking contact. Why would it? It had fuel for days of hunting. It had hundreds of depth charges in its magazines. It had sonar that could track a submarine through water the way a hawk tracks a mouse in a field. And somewhere over the horizon, it probably had friends, other destroyers responding to its contact report, forming a hunter-killer group that would systematically destroy I-36 through sheer persistence and overwhelming numbers. Come to heading 270. Kusaka whispered to the helmsman. 5 degrees down, Bubble. Take us to 110 meters. This was beyond I-36's maximum rated depth. At 110 meters, the pressure would stress the hull beyond its design tolerances. But the Americans had set their depth charges for 90 meters, the optimal depth for destroying a submarine that was trying to evade. By going deeper, risking implosion to avoid certain destruction, Kusaka might put the submarine below the effective range of their weapons. The hull groaned. Water squeezed through a dozen small leaks, dripping from valve stems and pipe joints, collecting in puddles that men mopped continuously to keep the deck plates clear. The pressure gauge showed 100 meters, 105, 110. At this depth, if a major seal failed or a hull plate cracked, I-36 would flood in seconds, crushed by the weight of the ocean before anyone could even reach the escape hatches. More depth charges, but these were farther away. The destroyer was still dropping. Patterns, still hunting, but the patterns were centered at 90 meters, where they expected the submarine to be. At 110 meters, I-36 was below the kill zone, damaged but alive, creeping south at 2 knots on a heading that Kusaka hoped would take them out of the destroyer's search area. 3 hours later, the propeller's sounds faded. The destroyer had given up or been recalled to other duties. I-36 rose cautiously to 70 meters, a depth where the hull stopped groaning and the leaks became manageable. Damage control teams worked through the submarine, assessing casualties, repairing what could be repaired, marking what would need shipyard attention if they ever reached Brunei. The chief engineer's report was grim. 1 battery cell cracked and leaking acid, 2 electric motors running hot from damaged bearings, the stern plane hydraulics damaged and operating on manual backup only, 40% of their battery charge expended in the evasion, and no opportunity to surface for recharging until darkness fell. They had enough power for 8 hours of submerged operation at slow speed, less if they needed to evade again. Kusaka studied his charts. They were 130 nautical miles from the rendezvous point off Brunei, where I-36 would meet a tanker that would provide fuel for the return to Kure. At 2 knots submerged, the journey would take 65 hours, 3 days, assuming they encountered no more destroyers, assuming the damaged motors held together, assuming the Americans did not have the entire area saturated with hunter-killer groups. He surfaced after sunset, taking the submarine up slowly, carefully, watching through the periscope for any sign of patrol aircraft or destroyers. The ocean was empty, at least in the small circle of visibility that the fading twilight allowed. I-36 broke the surface, and the diesels roared to life, charging batteries and pushing the submarine south at 14 knots towards safety that seemed impossibly distant. They made it 32 nautical miles before the radar detector screamed its warning. This was technology that had not existed when Kusaka graduated from Etajima. The Americans had developed radar radio direction-finding equipment that could detect ships and aircraft at distances far beyond visual range, and had installed it on every destroyer, every escort, every patrol aircraft in their fleet. I-36 carried a primitive detector that could sense when radar beams were sweeping the ocean, and could give warning that something was out there searching. It could not tell Kusaka where the enemy was or how far away. It could only tell him that he had been detected, that somewhere in the darkness, a destroyer or aircraft had painted his submarine with invisible radio waves and was now closing for the kill. Crash, dive. All ahead full. I-36 went under again, and this time Kusaka knew they would not surface until they reached Brunei or died trying. The batteries were at 41% charge, enough for perhaps 12 hours of submerged operation if they were careful, less if they had to evade at high speed. 12 hours to cover 100 miles through waters that the Americans controlled with their radars and sonars and endless supply of destroyers. The mathematics were clear. They would not make it. But mathematics had been wrong before. Intelligence had said 50 destroyers. The reality had been hundreds. Perhaps mathematics would be wrong again, in I-36's favor this time, and they would slip through whatever screen the Americans had established and reach the rendezvous and survive to file reports that no one would believe because the numbers were too large and the implications too terrible. The destroyer found them 2 hours before dawn. This one had sophisticated sonar that locked onto I-36 and tracked her through every evasion Kusaka attempted. The depth charges came in patterns that were almost mathematical in their precision, bracketing the submarine, forcing her deeper, draining her batteries as she twisted and turned and tried desperately to break contact. At 04:30 hours on November 16th, with battery power at 8% and the pressure hull leaking from a dozen stressed seams, Kusaka faced the decision that every submarine commander dreaded. He could continue submerged until the batteries died and the submarine became a drifting tomb, helpless as the destroyer located her with sonar and destroyed her at leisure. Or he could surface and surrender, hoping the Americans would respect the laws of naval warfare and take his crew prisoner rather than machine gunning them in the water. "Surface the boat," he said. "Prepare to abandon ship." I-36 rose slowly through the dark water, her electric motors silent now, her batteries exhausted, buoyancy alone carrying her toward the surface. When the conning tower broke into the dawn air, Kusaka was the first up the ladder, emerging into a world of light and wind and the smell of the ocean that seemed impossibly fresh after days breathing the submarine's fouled air. The destroyer was 3,000 yards away, approaching slowly, her guns trained on the submarine but not firing. Kusaka could see her hull number through binoculars. D. 527. D. A fleet destroyer, not an escort. A proper warship with 5-inch guns and torpedo tubes, and probably depth charges still loaded and ready, if I-36 attempted any treachery. 527. The Americans had built more than 500 destroyers of the fleet type alone, not counting the destroyer escorts with their DE designations that ran into the 200s at least. The true number was larger than anything Kusaka had imagined even in his darkest calculations. Not 50 destroyers, not 100. Hundreds. Perhaps approaching 1,000 when you counted both fleet destroyers and destroyer escorts. The Imperial Japanese Navy had begun the war with approximately 112 destroyers. They had built perhaps 30 more in 3 years of war. They had lost at least 60 to combat and accidents. Japan now possessed fewer destroyers than America had lost in the same period. And America had responded to its losses by building 5, 6, 7 times as many replacements, by treating destroyers as consumable items to be produced in bulk and deployed without restraint. This was the final revelation, the one that made all the others comprehensible. America was not fighting a war of survival. America was fighting a war of production, treating the conflict as an industrial problem to be solved through overwhelming material superiority. And Japan, no matter how brave its sailors or how skilled its commanders or how sharp its swords, could not win an industrial problem with spiritual solutions. The destroyer lowered a boat. Kusaka watched it approach, watched the American sailors rowing with casual efficiency, and he thought of all the things he would tell the intelligence officers when they debriefed him, if he survived captivity, if Japan lasted long enough for him to come home. He would tell them about the 17 destroyers in a single convoy screen. He would tell them about the 57 destroyers protecting one task force. He would tell them about the destroyer escorts that appeared in swarms, about the radar that made night attacks suicidal, about the sonar that tracked submarines through every evasion, about the depth charges that fell in patterns too precise to be luck. But most of all, he would tell them what he had learned from hull number D 527, that Japan had lost the war not at Midway or Guadalcanal or in any battle where courage and skill could make a difference. Japan had lost the war in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, in the shipyards of Bath and Quincy, in the steel mills and coal mines and oil refineries of a nation that could build weapons faster than Japan could deploy soldiers to use them. The American boat reached I-36. A young officer stood in the bow, his uniform clean and well-fitted, his posture relaxed. He called up to Kusaka in English that was clear but accented. "Commander, Please order your crew to abandon ship. We will take you aboard our vessel. You and your men will be treated in accordance with international law." Kusaka nodded. He turned to his executive officer and gave the order, and one by one the crew of I-36 climbed out of their submarine for the last time, leaving behind the charts and logs and machinery that had been their world. As they boarded the American boat, Kusaka noticed details that would have been invisible in the abstract, but were painfully obvious in person. The Americans' uniforms were new, unstained, warm against the morning chill. Their equipment was well maintained, their boat painted and cared for. They moved with the easy confidence of men who knew their navy dominated the ocean, who had never questioned whether the next convoy would arrive or whether the next destroyer would be available to rescue them. Aboard DD 527, Kusaka was separated from his crew and taken to the captain's cabin. The American captain was perhaps 5 years younger than Kusaka, a lieutenant commander with decorations that indicated he had seen action but not, Kusaka suspected, the desperate, grinding combat that had aged every Japanese naval officer a decade in 3 years. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a desk and chair and a bunk with clean sheets. There was coffee, real coffee, the smell of it almost painful after months of the bitter substitute that was all Japan could provide its military. "Please, sit," the American captain said in careful Japanese. "You understand our language?" "I studied English at the academy," Kusaka replied. His voice sounded strange to him, the first time he had spoken at a normal volume in days rather than the whisper required for silent running. "Good. I want you to know that your crew will be well treated. They will be processed as prisoners of war and transferred to a facility in the Philippines, and from there probably to the United States. The war will be over for them, but they will be safe." Kusaka nodded. He did not ask about his own fate. Officers were sometimes separated from their crew, questioned more intensively. He had accepted this possibility when he gave the order to surface. The American captain poured coffee into 2 cups and offered one to Kusaka. The gesture was almost painfully normal, 2 naval officers sharing a drink, the kind of professional courtesy that existed before the war, when navies met in port and exchanged visits. Kusaka took the cup and sipped, and the coffee was excellent, rich and hot and unsweetened. In Japan, he had not tasted real coffee since 1942. "May I ask you something?" the American captain said. Professional curiosity, one commander to another. "You may ask." "Your submarine, she was damaged. You were running on the surface when we detected you. Why did you come to this area?" "It is heavily patrolled. Every approach to the Philippines has multiple destroyer groups assigned. We detect 3 or 4 submarines a week, and we sink most of them. Your commanders must know this by now." "So why continue sending submarines here?" Kusaka considered the question. It was fair, asked without malice, and the answer would not compromise any military secret that the Americans did not already know. "We did not know," he said finally. "Intelligence told us you had perhaps 50 destroyers in the entire Pacific theater. We planned our patrols accordingly, looking for gaps in your coverage. We expected to find cargo ships escorted by 2 or 3 destroyers. We expected to have opportunities to attack." The American captain stared at him. 50 destroyers? In the Pacific? He seemed genuinely confused. "We have. I don't know the exact number. Hundreds, certainly. My ship is DD 527. There are destroyer escorts. 2, maybe 200 of those completed by now? And we're building more every week. Wasn't your intelligence?" He stopped, understanding the dawning on his face. Understanding, and something that might have been a pity. "You didn't know," he said softly. "They sent you out here thinking you'd face 50 destroyers." "Not 50 in this area," Kusaka clarified, though the clarification made the error no less catastrophic. 50 total. In all of the Pacific, from Alaska to Australia, your intelligence must have similar estimates of our forces. Surely you calculated how many destroyers the Americans would build based on your industrial capacity and shipyard productivity. The American captain nodded, slowly. We did calculate, before the war. Our estimates were too low. Actually, we've exceeded our own projections. But we knew we would build hundreds of destroyers. We designed them specifically for mass production. Simplified systems, prefabricated components, standardized parts. We built entire new shipyards just for destroyer construction. It's what America does. Mass production. Henry Ford built cars this way. We just applied the same principles to warships. Kusaka closed his eyes. Of course it was that simple. The Americans had not invented some revolutionary new technology. They had simply applied manufacturing techniques that any industrial nation understood to a domain where those techniques had never been used before. They had looked at warship construction and asked not, how do we build the best destroyer, but how do we build adequate destroyers quickly? And Japan had asked the wrong question. Japan had built excellent destroyers, technological, marvels like the Fubuki class, with their superior torpedoes and night-fighting capability. But excellent destroyers took time to build. Adequate destroyers built quickly accumulated into overwhelming superiority through sheer numbers. How many have you built? Kusaka asked. Total, fleet destroyers and escorts combined. The American captain hesitated. This was probably classified information, but both men knew it no longer mattered. The war's outcome was decided. The only question was how long until Japan accepted the inevitable. I'm not certain of the exact figure, he said carefully, but I know my ship is in the 500s for fleet destroyers. The escorts are in the 200s for completed hulls. There are more under construction, many more. The Navy's goal is… He paused. I probably shouldn't tell you this. Please, Kusaka said. I have spent 2 years fighting ghosts. I would like to understand the shape of the thing that has been hunting me. The American captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded. The Navy's goal is approximately 350 fleet destroyers and 500 destroyer escorts by the end of 1945. We're on track to meet that goal. Some shipyards are ahead of schedule. 350 plus 500, 850 destroyers and escorts. The number was so large that Kusaka almost laughed. The Imperial Japanese Navy, with its proud tradition and its samurai spirit and its oxygen torpedoes and its belief in the decisive battle that would shatter the enemy's will, was fighting an enemy that had built 800 destroyers while Japan struggled to replace the ones it had lost. We thought we were fighting a navy, Kusaka said quietly. We were fighting a factory. The American captain nodded. Yes, that's exactly right. You were fighting a factory. The largest factory in the world. And factories don't care about courage or tradition or fighting spirit. They just produce. They take in raw materials on one end and output finished products on the other, and the only thing that stops them is running out of materials. And America isn't going to run out of materials. 2 naval officers who understood that the war had been decided not by admirals or battles or strategy, but by production capacity and industrial organization. Kusaka thought of all the submarines that had been lost, all the destroyers that Japan had expended, all the carriers sunk at Midway, all the battleships destroyed at Leyte Gulf. Every loss had been a tragedy for Japan, a vessel that could not be replaced, a crew that took years to train. Every American loss had been an inconvenience, a number on a production report, a gap in the line that would be filled by a replacement vessel that was already under construction before the original had even been sunk. What will you tell your superiors? The American captain asked. When the war is over and you go home. The truth, Kusaka said. That we lost the war before it began. That we never had a chance, not against an enemy that could build destroyers the way you build them. That the plan was flawed from the start, because it assumed America would fight the war we wanted them to, fight a war of skill and courage and decisive battles, not a war of production, not a war of numbers so overwhelming that skill became irrelevant. Will they believe you? Kusaka thought of the intelligence officers in Tokyo, of the admirals who had planned the war, of the emperor who had sanctioned it. Would they believe that Japan's vaunted navy had been crushed not by superior tactics or technology, but by American welders and shipyard workers and industrial managers? Would they accept that the samurai spirit could not overcome production lines and assembly schedules? I don't know, he said honestly. But perhaps it no longer matters whether they believe. The destroyers will keep coming, whether they believe in them or not. 350. You will build them until we have no ships left to fight them with, and then you will build more, and eventually there will be so many that resistance becomes impossible. Not because we lack courage, but because you have more steel. The American captain stood, indicating the interview was over. I hope you survive the war, Commander. I hope you go home to your family. And I hope that when you do, someone listens to what you have to say. Because you understand something that most people won't understand until years after the war is over, that modern war isn't decided by warriors, it's decided by workers, by the people who build the ships and planes and tanks and bombs. Japan has brave warriors, but America has more workers. And, in this kind of war, that's all that matters. Kusaka was taken to a compartment below decks where his crew was already gathered. They looked at him with questions in their eyes, but he had no answers to give them except the truth they already knew, that their war was over, that their submarine would be scuttled, that they would spend the rest of the conflict as prisoners in a camp somewhere far from the ocean that had been their world. Through a porthole, he watched as American sailors rigged charges on I-36. She would be sunk in deep water, removed from the war like a chess piece taken from the board. The Americans could not risk her being salvaged or her technology examined, even though, and Kusaka understood this now, even though Japanese technology no longer mattered. Oxygen torpedoes and superior night-fighting optics could not overcome radar and mass destroyer escorts and the simple arithmetic of attrition. I-36 slipped beneath the waves at noon, her hull cracked by demolition charges, settling toward the bottom with all her charts and logs and the patrol diary that Kusaka had kept since the war began. With her went the evidence of what he had seen. The 17-destroyer convoy, the 57-destroyer task force, the endless procession of hull numbers that spoke to production rates that defied belief. But the evidence no longer mattered, because the truth would become obvious soon enough to anyone who looked at the Pacific with clear eyes. Japan had gambled that America lacked the will to fight, that one decisive blow would shatter their resolve and force them to the negotiating table. But America had answered with destroyers. Not tens of destroyers. Not dozens. Hundreds. Soon thousands. Each one a message written in steel. That America's will was backed by industrial capacity so vast that it could absorb any loss and return with more weapons, more ships, more of everything that modern war required. Commander Toshio Kusaka spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in Louisiana, where he learned to speak better English and worked on a farm growing cotton. He was repatriated to Japan in 1946, one of the lucky few who survived captivity to return home. He found his wife, Fumiko, still tending her garden behind their house in Yokosuka, still waiting. He told her about the destroyers, not 17 in one convoy or 57 in one task force, but the hundreds he had learned about during his captivity, the numbers that an American guard had told him with casual pride. 349 fleet destroyers built by war's end, 420 destroyer escorts, numbers that made even the guard pause and shake his head in wonder at his nation's productive capacity. 349. Not 50. Not the number that Japanese intelligence had assured him represented American destroyer strength in the entire Pacific. 349 fleet destroyers, plus over 400 escorts, a combined fleet larger than anything any nation had ever built, produced in 4 years by a country that had been at peace in 1941. Kusaka never returned to the sea. He taught at a school in Yokosuka, instructing children in mathematics and English, and sometimes he spoke to history classes about the war. He did not speak of battles or heroism or the samurai code. He spoke about numbers, about industrial capacity, about the day he had counted 17 destroyers through a periscope and realized that everything he had been taught was wrong. About hull number D 527, and the young American captain who had treated him with respect and given him coffee and explained that Japan had been fighting not a navy but a factory. "We expected 50 destroyers," he would tell the students, and they would write this down dutifully. There were 349. The gap between expectation and reality was not just a number, it was the distance between the world we imagined and the world that actually existed. And you cannot win a war against the world that actually exists by believing in the world you wish existed. In 1973, at a conference on naval history in Tokyo, Kusaka met a retired American admiral who had commanded destroyers in the Pacific. They spoke for hours, comparing notes, discovering that they had been in the same waters at the same times, that the admiral's destroyer had perhaps been one of the 17 that Kusaka had counted through his periscope that morning in November 1944. The admiral spoke of the fear his crews had felt when submarine alerts came, of the depth charge attacks that sometimes went on for hours, of the respect they had for Japanese submarine commanders who pressed attacks despite overwhelming odds. "You were brave," the admiral said. "All of you. You kept fighting when you must have known the war was lost." "We didn't know," Kusaka replied. "Not until it was too late. We didn't know about the 349 destroyers. We thought we were fighting 50. If we had known the truth, perhaps we would have found the courage to end the war sooner. Perhaps that would have been the braver thing." The admiral nodded. "Knowing when you're beaten is its own kind of courage. Admitting it takes strength. America won the war, but we didn't win because we were braver or because our sailors were better. We won because we could build ships faster than you could sink them. That's not a moral victory. That's just arithmetic." "Arithmetic," Kusaka agreed. "The war came down to arithmetic. How many ships can you build? How many can you afford to lose? How long can you sustain the loss rate? We answered those questions incorrectly, and so we lost. It's that simple, and that complicated." Commander Toshio Kusaka died in 1984, at the age of 74, having lived to see Japan rebuild into an economic power that rivaled the industrial might of nations that had defeated it. He died knowing that the lesson he had learned through a periscope in November 1944, that modern war is decided by factories and workers, and production capacity, had been learned by his nation at terrible cost. Japan had tried to fight an industrial war with spiritual weapons, and the destroyers had kept coming, 349 of them, until there were no more submarines to send against them. In his final interview, given to a historian documenting submarine operations in World War II, Kusaka was asked what he remembered most clearly from his service. He thought for a long moment, then answered, "The numbers. I remember counting destroyers through the periscope and realizing that everything I knew was wrong. I remember hull numbers that went into the hundreds when we expected dozens. I remember learning that America had built 850 destroyers and escorts while we struggled to build 30. But most of all, I remember the sound of their propellers overhead, always there, always hunting, always coming back, no matter how many we sank or evaded. That sound taught me what we were really fighting. Not courage against courage, not skill against skill, but infinity against limitation. And infinity always wins." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.